delineates the content. The author draws linguistic equations between the Allies' war against Germany, again, something that Don and I discussed yesterday, and the German war against the rest of the world, especially the extermination on the Eastern Front and against the European Jews. For instance, in Friedrich's account, the air raid shelters in which German civilians sought refuge became crematoria. The bombing victims become exterminated. The Royal Air Force 5th Bomber Group becomes an Einsatzgruppe. The special task forces for rounding up and massacring the Jews in occupied Europe, as you well know. Although certain prominent scholars, notably, for instance, Hans-Ulrich Wehler, certainly a major German historian, criticized the book very, very heavily. If you read the criticism, they mostly object to the glib writing style and the analogies between the Holocaust and Dresden, while remaining largely silent about its substance and overall implications for Germany's political discourse. Indeed, the book won great popularity and further indicates the widening discourse of normalization in Germany. Again, the point being here, under the Red-Green Coalition, again, like Walser, clearly Jörg Friedrich not in any way close to the right, Nazi, neo-Nazi, any of this. Lastly, of course, Günter Grasses, and I can't go bigger than that, Nobel laureate. I think with Heinrich Böll, arguably, post-war Germany's most important intellectual and writer. In his famous book, Im Krebsgang, or in English, Crab Walk, in which he looks at the sinking of the East Prussian coast of the German ship Wilhelm Gustloff, packed with German refugees from the oncoming Red Army. Let me here quote the aforementioned Don Diener from a piece that he wrote about this. The Holocaust's burden of guilt is perpetually searching for exoneration. This is not the first time that exoneration has been tied to the urge to help gain recognition for suffering experienced in World War II, such as the bombing war and the expulsion of German refugees. This is indeed a most honorable concern. But, as if guided by an invisible hand, it ends up flowing into old channels. But as if guided by an invisible hand, it ends up flowing into old channels, period. Thus, in his historical tale about the refugee ship Wilhelm Gustloff, Günter Grass, I'm still quoting Diener, Günter Grass insists on constructing a narrative framework in which, although a real live Jew is not murdered, an imaginary one certainly is. Murdered by a sympathetically portrayed young neo-Nazi who wants nothing more than to make remembrance of German suffering accessible to public mourning. With both the imaginary Jew and the neo-Nazi who was reformed in jail apparently forming antipodes, struggling with each other inside the collective soul. The narrator confronts the dilemma of having to choose to sacrifice one at the expense of the other. The decision was obviously not hard for him to reach. The internalization, felt to be Jewish. The memory that was felt to have been imposed like a second re-education had to be discarded through an act of killing. In this way, the symbolic deed experienced as an act of liberation is recirculated within a compulsion of repetition. The whole debate through the Grass book and others led to a major discussion about creating a center against the expulsion that should have been the parallel to the Holocaust Memorial. And again, I won't have time here because I really should stop. The whole debate about the CDU-CSU motions for something called overarching conception for a dignified commemoration of the victims of both German dictatorship, introduced in the Bundestag on the 17th of June 2004. By the way, an important date, because until German unification, the 17th of June was a West German holiday commemorating, of course, the crushing of the first revolt against Soviet troops anywhere in East Berlin. which has then been reinterpreted actually in a very nationalist way. Basically, the debate about equating the two dictatorships, okay? Communist, Nazi. There's a kind of a weighing scale mentality. Let me end with two important campaigns of this year, and I'll conclude, really finish in 5 minutes. In the defense of the so-called German model, again, in many ways, I think a very commendable model, against the Rhenish capitalism, as it's known, as opposed to Anglo-American casino capitalism. And again, having published a lot on German social democracy and German labor movement, trust me, in many ways, a much more humane model of capitalism. That's not the issue here. Okay? It's again the context. In defense of this model, the aforementioned Franz Müntefering, then chairman of the SPD, invoked in his analogy of American hedge funds so-called locust firms that descend anonymously upon innocent, well-meaning German companies only to strip them of their assets. The SPD's locust campaign this past May was popular among the party's rank and file as well as the public at large. Müntefering's remarks were reinforced by an article in Stern, the aforementioned. It's an interesting, we don't have this in the English speaking, at least in America. It's kind of a pictorial like Life, but much more political and very highbrow and sort of an interesting kind of magazine. I can't quite characterize it for you. In which 7 of these locust firms were indeed listed by name, some of them clearly Jewish. Not to be outdone, Germany's most prominent labor union, IG Metall, far and away I think Europe's most important trade union, featured an article on the same subject in its May 2005 issue of its magazine Metall, titled US Firmen in Deutschland, die Aussager, US companies in Germany, the bloodsuckers. The cover depicts a mosquito doffing an Uncle Sam-like hat with the American flag, grinning ravenously under its huge nose, revealing, of all things, apropos from Germany, a gold-filled tooth. It carries an American-style attaché case and is ready to descend upon the hapless German economy. The article inside the magazine carries the title, Die Plünderer sind da, the plunderers are here. There's actually a brilliant analysis, far more than I did and will do here, 2 weeks ago at a fascinating conference on anti-Americanism in Princeton. And a German journalist used this picture it was phenomenal. In the 57-year history of Metall, the monthly journal, there's never been a more successful issue than the one featuring a barely disguised anti-Semitic cover and a thinly veiled anti-Semitic feature article. Although in both the SPD's locust campaign and IG Metall's mosquito campaign, suddenly it became a mosquito follow-up, anti-Semitism had to be conveyed subtly. This was clearly not so subtly clearly with anti-Americanism. Concluding, in today's Europe and Germany, it is not traditional anti-Semitism, typically espoused by the right for much of the 20th century, that should be of concern. Few would not sit next to a Jew in public place. Few worry about Jews being overrepresented in medicine, law, etc. Instead, it has been an anti-Semitism of the liberal and radical left, almost exclusively derived from its hatred of Israel that legitimates it, that has fueled the legitimacy of much of contemporary anti-Semitism in Europe. And then, of course, the right can now join in the bandwagon. Here, too, however, there's a historical continuity. A 1990 study of the German left anti-Semitism then demonstrated that its animosity towards Israel often displayed an anti-Semitic tone and content. Martin Kloke's book, The German Left and Israel and Anti-Semitism, is unsurpassed. Brilliant guy, you should begin. He's been to Israel a lot. The overlap between hatred of Israel and anti-Semitism as a core of certain leftist subcultures is discussed in a new book, about an incident in West Berlin on 9 November 1969, in which radical German terrorists, modeling themselves on the Tupamaros of Uruguay and calling themselves Tupamaros West Berlin, planted a bomb in the Jewish Community Center. Another guy whom you should invite is the author of this book, Wolfgang Kraushaar. When this came out in June, late June, I mean, I've never seen media coverage like this. Amazing research. It was intended, this bomb, of course, 31-year anniversary of Kristallnacht. It was intended to explode during the commemoration of the 31-year Kristallnacht in the Jewish Community Center and would have killed hundreds of people had it not been for a technical glitch. This occurred in a post-Holocaust West Germany, in which anti-Semitism had supposedly all but disappeared, especially among the country's self-proclaimed progressives, who made their alleged overcoming of their parents' Nazi past the centerpiece of their purportedly enlightened outlook. Kraushaar shows that the leaders had deeply, deeply anti-Semitic traits, again, fueled partly by the Israeli, but again, the issue of power. One of the conspirators had spent the summer before that in a kibbutz in Israel. The next summer, he then spent in a Fatah camp in Lebanon. Thus, to conclude, while the uninhibitedness may indeed be new in terms of its broad public acceptance in Germany and Europe, its roots go back decades, if not centuries. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take questions. First, Dr. Avner Falk, second, Dr. Shalom Friedman, third, Dr. Joel Fishman, fourth, Professor Richard Landes. That's it for the moment. Avner?
I use the microphone or just speak like that?
Elizabeth decides.
Okay. First of all, thank you for a very, very interesting lecture.
Thank you.
Very erudite as well. I want to make one minor point and one perhaps less minor. You mentioned the Israeli psychoanalyst who said the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz, which is a very astute saying. And I'm going to go back to that in the more important point. The name of the psychoanalyst, by the way, is not familiar to me, and I do know most of the analysts of our generation, so I wonder who it may be or whether you have the name correctly.
Yeah, no, I have it correctly. I mean, this I know, but I've actually never met the guy. And
Did you say Rex or
Rex? Rex.
Rex.
R-E-X.
Well, I don't know the man, but he may well have said that. I've heard it before, quoted, attributed to other people, but he may be the originator. Anyway, about the Treitschke and Mommsen debate, if I'm not mistaken, this was part of the height of the German Kulturkampf,
Yes.
which was really the war of Bismarck and company against the Catholic Church.
Right,
So
right.
it has to be seen in that context.
Right.
This is the minor point.
Right.
The major point is what the Germans call the Vergangenheitsüberwältigung.
Bewältigung. Nicht Überwältigung.
Yeah, sure, of course, I'm sorry. The Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which would be translated as mastery of the past. Perhaps it's very hard to translate that expression.
Coming to terms with the past.
Yes. You know Mark Twain's The Awful German Language, in which he tries to translate from German into English, and it's never successful. You can never really get the correct translation. But this, I wonder, what is your opinion as to whether this Vergangenheitsbewältigung is actually possible or whether it's an illusion?
Okay.
Because you see, mastering the past really means overcoming it, forgetting it, coming to terms with the guilt feelings and so on.
Yeah.
And the fact is that these guilt feelings do keep pursuing the Germans.
Right.
They never disappear, they cannot really disappear. Or perhaps they can. That's what I'd like you to comment on, whether this Vergangenheitsbewältigung is some kind of collective illusion or whether it is actually taking place.
Do I have a week? Okay, can I respond?
Do you want one by one?
Well, I'd like to say something to this. This is a major question. I mean,
okay.
I don't mean to.
No.
Here's, look, the answer is twofold. Onefold is, from my point of view, and I think that of most Jews, the answer is no, it can't be done. One could go even further and say, should it be done? Some would argue it shouldn't even be done. I'm actually not, in this case, I'm on public record for having given the Federal Republic, the West Germans, credit like no one ever, okay? In fact, if you look at a society that tries and has tried to come to terms with its past, nobody has come close to what the West Germans have done. Kol hakavod, big deal, and I mean this, okay? It was from society, it was not imposed, the so-called by fiat in East Germany. Oh, it's all capitalism? You're not capitalist, so fine, exonerated. Wholesale exoneration by the popes of the Central Committee. By the way, the only thing that was really, really popular in East Germany was this, that they did not have to feel guilty. The West Germans were all the Nazis. In fact, there's examples that some East German kids thought that the Volksarmee, or the liberation, that they were liberating from the Nazis together with the Red Army. Okay? So don't get, I mean, in terms of, if you look at the studies, if you look at just the three comparable the successor states to the Third Reich. Okay? West Germans are massively, normatively, quantitatively, on every count, way ahead of the East Germans and of the Austrians, both of whom had an important exit option, which the West Germans didn't, namely that of being victims. The Austrians, by the Moscow Declaration of '43, we are the first victims of Hitler, of the Nazi Reich, which is true that it says that, but of course the Austrians never went into the next paragraph, where the Moscow Declaration said, but that does not exonerate you. You have to look at the responsibility that you did in the Hitler war machine. And so, to answer your question, I actually think that the West Germans have done a tremendous amount. So my paper, I don't mean in this to indict it, I'm just trying to show how this is an immensely difficult issue. I actually think that it will certainly not happen during my generation, nor can it. Also, actually, don't quite know. That's why I like the question. I'm not quite sure what that is. What is that to mean? Is it to mean? You could say.
That's why I'm calling it in the loop.
Well, or no.
It's no specific meaning.
Well, but at least So they confront this. They have worked with it. Again, I've also made it part of my professional life to not only commend them, but always also say that it should have been here, this, whatever, not enough, different. But on the whole, compare, for instance, if you look at The Wages of Guilt, the great book by Ian Buruma, compared to the Japanese, I mean, can you imagine? It doesn't even exist, but could you imagine Angela Merkel pilgriming to some SS grave every 2 days or whatever? To the what?
That's what the Mitchellisten said, the Unfähigkeit zu trauern, the inability to mourn. They're not really mourned in us as a collective. They've not really been able to mourn.
Well, I read that differently. I'm saying, Mitchell said, I see that differently. I see it as precisely as coming to terms with the past. And precisely realizing that without that, by the way, there wouldn't be an EU. Without that, Germany's neighbors would not be what they are. Now they might not like the Dutch, will never like the German, but that's a joke. It's you always hate the big guy. End of story. But the point is that I think they have made immense strides, have made attempts, and the fact that again, a German head of state does not go to SS graves.
Bitburg.
Well, Bitburg was one exception and had true. Interesting contact. We can talk about that too. So my answer to your important question is one has to actually discuss for whom is it an important point. I cannot overcome that in this case I have a Jewish point of view. So for my attitude, is it sufficient? To me, nothing will be sufficient. Okay, so in fact, I'm a terrible partner here because it's not sufficient. It's great, but it ain't sufficient. It's not sufficient. I'm not quite sure what would be sufficient. But I think that in the context they have, however, it is also interesting, that's what my paper is trying to deal with, that new discourses are coming in, which doesn't negate that the Germans have in fact and continue to deal with the past, but that it's a contested, it's a contested matter. It's a public space, it's a democracy, a contested discourse in which new words, new dimensions have entered the language. And my main point here is that it comes from the liberal left, and it comes via Israel, or if we were to hold constant, okay? If Israel, Gott behüten, would not exist or would have lost, this wouldn't happen, okay? Because Israel would be weak. The Jews would be weak. So the Jews would be like, animals, handicapped, whatever, which we in fact protect. But by the Jews being Rambos, okay, it's fair in public discourse, which is driven, again, to my satisfaction, by left liberal enlightenment, the Jews have now have gone to the dark side, by virtue of Israel's power.
Okay. You want one by one, because otherwise we don't.
No, fine, then let's collect them.
Okay, we collect. First Shalom, then Joel, then Richard.
Then I need a little, because I will not remember everything. Yes.
Okay, my question relates to a change in the world situation. Now, Israel is once again threatened publicly in such a way that the world perceives it as perhaps not a weaker party, but certainly a threatened party by the genocidal intentions of Iran. How does the whole Muslim factor and the fact that the Arab world has called for Israel's destruction through the years affect the left's perception of the weakness of Israel, the strength of Israel? Another small question is, you haven't spoken about the political echelon and the political question. Germany sends Israel submarines now. Merkel is coming to Israel now. What about, is there a great difference between the responsibility felt by the leadership and the feeling of the general public?
Joel?
Yes. One question and one